It started as just another ordinary morning in a quiet, small-town classroom, until one little girl refused to sit in her chair. The 6-year-old curled up beneath her desk, clutching her stomach as laughter echoed around her. But when her teacher knelt down and gently lifted the hem of her skirt to check if she was hurt, the laughter stopped. What she saw in that moment changed everything. A discovery so shocking it sent the teacher running from the room with tears in her eyes, carrying the trembling child out of the classroom and rushing her to the hospital. What happened next will leave you speechless and questioning everything you thought you knew about kindness, courage, and silent heroes. Before we begin, remember to like and subscribe. And truly, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Leave your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far our stories can travel. The morning light in Willow Creek had that fragile golden stillness only early autumn could bring. The air smelled faintly of dew and chalk dust as the small town stirred awake, and sunlight streamed through the tall classroom windows of Willow Creek Elementary. The sound of pencils tapping, pages turning, and soft laughter of children filled the room like a familiar melody. Behind her wooden desk, Miss Madison Cole arranged a row of storybooks, her mind half in her lesson plan, half in the simple piece of routine. She was in her early 40s, a woman with calm eyes and a quiet dignity earned through years of patience. Her students adored her gentleness, her way of seeing more than what was said. But that morning, something in the air felt off, a note of silence beneath the hum of childish noise. At the far corner of the classroom, under the last row of desks near the window, a small figure had folded into herself like a frightened bird. The girl's name was Emily Carter, 6 years old, a child of pale skin and soft flaxen hair that curled lightly around her temples. Her eyes, a shade of blue so light they almost seemed translucent, were now filled with tears. She sat pressed against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, as if she were holding herself together. While the other children chatted and whispered about picture books and morning snacks, Emily remained there, silent, trembling, and refusing to move. When Miss Cole called her name gently, the little girl shook her head. A murmur of amusement rippled through the room. Some children giggled, others whispered, their curiosity bubbling into cruel laughter. To them, Emily was the quiet one, the girl who rarely spoke, who sometimes stared out the window instead of coloring, the girl who always seemed afraid of something unseen. One boy at the back smirked and said, "She's pretending again." The laughter grew louder, and Miss Cole's brows furrowed. She rose from her chair, her heels soft against the linoleum, and crossed the room to where the small body hid beneath the desk. "Emily, sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling beside her. "Can you come out for a moment?" But Emily didn't answer. Her little shoulders quivered. When Madison reached out a hand, the girl flinched as though from pain. Something was deeply wrong. The teacher's voice dropped to a whisper, warm and trembling with concern. "Are you hurt, my dear?" Emily turned her face away, tears glistening. Her lips moved, but no words came. Then, as Madison gently tried to lift her up, she felt a dampness against her hand, something that made her heart freeze. The smell hit her next, acrid, unmistakable, a mix of urine and something far worse. A hush fell over the class as Madison, with trembling fingers, lifted the hem of the child's skirt just enough to see. What she saw made her chest tighten painfully. The child's clothes were soaked through, her legs, streaked with faint redness, her small body stiff with shame. Gasps escaped around the room, and then laughter, cruel and sharp, like stones thrown in a sacred place. Madison stood upright instantly. Her voice thundered, "Enough!" The sound cracked through the laughter like lightning. "No one," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "no one ever laughs at another's pain. Not in my classroom. Not ever." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ticking of the clock seemed hesitant to continue. Madison turned back to the child, now weeping silently, and knelt again, this time more carefully. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're safe with me." The girl's breath came in shivers. Without hesitation, Madison gathered her into her arms. The smell, the mess, the weight of her fear meant nothing now. She carried her out of the classroom as every child watched, their faces pale and confused. Down the quiet hallway she went, the echo of her hurried footsteps following like a heartbeat, the little girl's sobs muffled against her shoulder. At the nurse's office, Madison explained in a rush, her voice breaking, and within minutes they were in her car heading toward Willow Creek General Hospital. The hospital's sterile brightness felt harsh after the warmth of the classroom. Madison sat beside the examination bed, her heart pounding as nurses moved with brisk professional urgency. The child's small hands clung to her sleeve even as doctors examined her. There was no sound except the soft beeping of monitors and the faint hum of air vents. When the results came, they spoke of things no teacher should have to hear. Emily suffered from severe bladder and bowel dysfunction, a condition requiring long-term care, likely left untreated for months. But there was more. The doctor, a woman with tired eyes, lifted the child's wrist gently and revealed faint purple shadows, old bruises overlapped by newer ones. On her back, small marks like fingerprints. A story written in silence on a 6-year-old's body. Madison felt her throat close. "Are you certain?" she whispered. The doctor nodded, eyes solemn. "Someone has been hurting her," she said. "These are not accidental." The room seemed to shrink around them. For a long time, neither spoke. Outside the window, the wind moved through the trees, and a leaf pressed against the glass before falling away. Madison looked at the child lying there, eyes closed, a soft tear slipping down her cheek, even in sleep. The teacher's chest ached with something deeper than anger. It was grief, helplessness, and a fierce rising protectiveness she had not felt in years. When Emily woke, her voice was barely audible. "I didn't mean to make a mess," she whispered. "Grandma says good girls don't tell secrets." Madison stroked her hair gently. "What secrets, darling?" The child hesitated, eyes wide with fear. "I can't say. Mama gets mad. Grandma, too." Her words stumbled into silence. Madison took a slow breath, choosing her next words as though they were glass. "Where do you live, sweetheart?" The little girl's answer was small and trembling. "With Mama and Rex." She paused, looking confused, then added, "Daddy's away. He's helping people. He's a hero." Madison's chest tightened. She knew that name now. Jack Carter, one of Willow Creek's own, a veteran of the U.S. Army deployed overseas for humanitarian service. A man respected in town, quiet, disciplined, his name mentioned in local papers with pride. The thought that his daughter was here, broken and bruised while he was half a world away, made something heavy settle in her stomach. She didn't yet know who Rex was, but the way the girl spoke the name, like speaking of a friend, not a pet, made her wonder. As the day faded into afternoon, the hospital room softened with the dimming light. Madison sat by the bedside, watching the child's slow breathing. She had seen many things in her 20 years of teaching, poverty, neglect, loneliness, but never something that pierced her like this. A 6-year-old too ashamed to sit, too afraid to speak, too accustomed to pain to even cry aloud. She glanced at the chart clipped to the bed, the inked notes of the doctor confirming physical abuse, malnutrition, untreated medical conditions. Her hand trembled as she set it back. Outside, through the window, the small town continued its quiet rhythm. Cars passing, shop doors closing, the sky turning gold and then gray. Madison thought of the classroom still waiting for her return, the children who had seen something that would stay with them, and of a father somewhere across the sea, unaware that his little girl's world had fallen apart in his absence. She reached out and gently covered Emily's small hand with her own. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, the child or herself. That night, as the nurse dimmed the lights, Madison stepped out into the hallway, her reflection faint in the glass door. The corridor was quiet, only the sound of machines and distant footsteps. She paused, hand pressed to her chest, the echo of Emily's trembling voice still inside her mind. Somewhere in that silence, a promise took root, not of duty, but of something stronger, something deeply human. For now, all she could do was ensure the little girl slept without fear. Tomorrow would bring questions, forms, and perhaps confrontation. But tonight, Madison Cole would simply stand guard in the small hours of a hospital corridor, watching over a child who had already suffered far too much. The next morning, After a sleepless night beside the hospital bed, Miss Madison Cole was asked to escort the little girl back home. The doctor said she was well enough to rest until her follow-up visit. Madison agreed, though unease lingered in her chest. Holding the child's small hand, she stepped into the pale light of dawn, unsure what kind of home awaited at the end of the long road out of Willow Creek. Miss Madison Cole drove slowly along the narrow road that led away from the town square, her small sedan following a dirt path lined with overgrown weeds. The tires crunched over gravel as she approached the address written in careful cursive on the discharge papers, a place she had never been, a part of town that felt forgotten by time. The house stood alone at the end of the lane, a modest wooden structure, its paint peeling in long, uneven strips. Grass and dandelions grew wild across the yard, swallowing the cracked walkway. A broken wind chime tapped faintly in the breeze, its sound strangely hollow. Madison parked the car and turned to the back seat where the little girl sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Emily looked smaller than ever, her pale face pressed to the window, eyes fixed on the worn porch steps ahead. She hadn't spoken much that morning, except to ask once if she would be going back to school soon. Madison had told her gently that the doctor wanted her to rest for a while. The girl had nodded, but said nothing more. The teacher's heart ached watching her, so still and obedient as though afraid to take up too much space in the world. When they stepped out, the smell of damp wood and stale air hung in the breeze. Madison took Emily's hand. The child's fingers were cool, almost fragile. Together they walked toward the door. It opened after the second knock. A woman appeared, tall, maybe in her mid-30s, striking in a distant sort of way. Her features were fine, almost beautiful, but her expression carried the tired glaze of someone who no longer cared to hide her indifference. This was Veronica, Emily's stepmother. Her hair was slightly tousled, her makeup faint but precise, her eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. She looked at Madison with the faint irritation of someone being interrupted. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. Madison introduced herself, explaining that she was Emily's teacher and had accompanied her from the hospital as per the doctor's instructions. Veronica's eyes flicked toward the child, then back to Madison. "She's fine," she said curtly. "She just overreacts sometimes, always has. Sensitive kid. Don't make a big deal out of it." Madison's instinct told her to hold back her words, to observe first. Veronica stepped aside reluctantly, gesturing toward the hallway. The air inside the house was thick with the faint smell of liquor and old cigarettes. Newspapers and clothes were scattered across the floor. Empty bottles stood like forgotten, sentinels on the coffee table. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting slivers of light cut across the dust-laden air. Madison's eyes wandered toward the narrow staircase that led upstairs, where faint scratching sounds came from one of the doors. Then she saw him, the dog. Rex lay stretched across the threshold of what appeared to be Emily's bedroom, his large frame blocking the entrance as if standing guard. He was a German shepherd, 6 years old, with a broad chest and powerful legs, his coat a rich blend of sable and tan, a dark saddle of black running along his back. His ears stood erect, his amber eyes sharp but calm. There was something noble about his stillness, protective, loyal, and quietly alert. When Madison's gaze met his, Rex's tail gave a single slow thump against the floorboards, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. Emily's face softened at the sight of him. She whispered something that sounded like, "Good boy." The dog's ears twitched, and his gaze followed her every step. Veronica leaned against the doorway, crossing her arms. "He follows her everywhere," she said with a faint smirk. "Drives me crazy sometimes. But I guess he's harmless." Her voice carried a brittle edge that made Madison uneasy. As the teacher moved farther into the room, she caught sight of the kitchen sink piled high with dishes, a layer of grime along the counter, and the faint hum of a refrigerator half filled with takeout containers. Veronica noticed her glance and shrugged. "I've been busy. Life's not easy, you know, especially raising someone else's kid." The words were delivered casually, but their weight hung heavy. Madison said nothing. She guided Emily toward her room while Veronica retreated toward the living room, where the television flickered to life. The teacher lingered by the doorway, looking around. The child's space was small but strangely tidy, a contrast to the rest of the house. A single bed against the wall, a few drawings taped beside it, uneven crayon sketches of a man in uniform, a dog beside him, and a smiling stick figure with yellow hair holding both their hands. Madison felt a pang in her chest. On the desk sat a cracked picture frame with the same trio: Jack Carter in his military fatigues, the dog Rex at his side, and a much younger Emily sitting on his lap. The glass was chipped, but the photo had been wiped clean, carefully preserved. As the afternoon light shifted, Veronica announced she had to run an errand. Her keys jingled, her tone indifferent. "Don't let her wander off," she said over her shoulder before slamming the door. The house fell silent. Madison stood still for a long moment, listening to the sound of the car fading down the road. Then she turned toward Emily's room and saw something that made her heart tighten. The little girl was on her knees beside a small plastic basin, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing her soiled clothes in cold water. Her thin arms moved mechanically, her expression blank, as though this were a chore she had long grown used to. A bucket and an old towel sat beside her. Madison's first instinct was to stop her, but she hesitated. There was a quiet dignity in the child's movements, not rebellion, but survival. "Emily," she said softly. The girl startled, glancing up, eyes wide. "I just have to clean them," she whispered quickly, as if afraid of being scolded. "Mama says I can't make messes." Madison knelt beside her, her throat tightening. "You don't have to do that right now," she said gently. "I'll help you." But Emily shook her head. "It's okay. I always do it. Rex helps me dry them." She smiled faintly at the dog, who was lying just behind her, tail moving in slow, steady beats. Madison's eyes traced the small bruises still visible on the child's wrists. She rose slowly, her gaze sweeping the room, the faint dent in the wall near the bed, a cracked doll on the floor, the uneven stack of canned food in the corner. Every detail spoke of neglect. She walked toward the doorway, looking back once more at the little girl, who had gone back to scrubbing. The sound of the cloth against water was rhythmic, haunting. Rex's gaze met hers again, and in it she saw something she could not name: understanding, warning, loyalty fused with sorrow. He gave a low rumble, barely audible, as if sensing her thoughts. In the dim corridor, Madison leaned against the wall, her hands trembling. This was not just about illness or poverty. It was something deeper, darker, the slow erosion of a child's safety. She thought of Jack Carter, the father somewhere oceans away, and of the promise she had made to herself in that hospital corridor the night before. A promise not to turn away again. The house smelled faintly of whiskey and loneliness. She closed her eyes and drew a long, steady breath. From inside the room came the sound of small footsteps and a quiet voice humming to the dog, a lullaby broken by fatigue. Madison turned back once more, watching the child rinse the last of her clothes and hang them carefully over the chair to dry. The water in the basin was gray now, swirling softly in the fading light. Rex stretched out beside her, resting his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving the girl. It was then, in that fragile moment, that Madison understood. This child was not being cared for. She was surviving in spite of it. The afternoon sun slipped lower, drawing long shadows across the wooden floor. Madison walked toward the front door, pausing once to glance back into the house that felt less like a home and more like a secret. Her heart ached with the certainty that what she had seen was only the surface. She stepped outside into the crisp air, the scent of pine and decay mingling in her lungs. Behind her, through the cracked window pane, she could still see the faint movement of a little girl folding her wet clothes, and the quiet figure of a loyal dog watching over her like a sentinel. 3 days later, the pale light of early morning crept across the windows of Willow Creek General Hospital as Miss Madison Cole guided the little girl through its glass doors once again. Emily walked close beside her, holding tightly to Madison's hand, her small frame trembling beneath the quiet hum of the sterile hallway. The doctors had agreed she should stay for several days of observation and treatment, though it was clear that the girl's greatest wounds were not the kind that could be found on a medical chart. Madison signed the admission papers while Emily stood silently near her leg, glancing at the nurses with wary eyes, her lips pressed together in a faint line of fear. She would not speak unless Madison spoke first. The pediatric ward was bright and clean, decorated with painted clouds and faded murals of animals meant to comfort children. But Emily didn't look at them. She only glanced once toward the window and then to the door, as if checking that her dog might somehow appear. When the nurse approached with a tray of food, she turned away, shrinking back against the pillow. It wasn't until Madison knelt beside her and asked softly, "Would you like me to call Rex?" that Emily's eyes filled with tears of relief. After a quiet discussion with the hospital staff, they made an unusual arrangement. Rex, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had once guarded her bedroom door, was allowed to stay by her bedside. The moment the dog padded into the room, his claws clicking softly against the floor, Emily reached out with a trembling hand and buried her fingers in his fur. Only then did she take a bite of food. Over the following days, the room transformed from a sterile space into something gentler, filled with soft laughter and whispered words. Madison spent every free hour there, sitting by Emily's bed, reading stories in a low, calming voice. Sometimes she brought crayons and paper from her classroom, encouraging the child to draw. At first, the drawings were hesitant and pale, stick figures with no faces, houses without doors. But by the third day, color returned, a girl with bright yellow hair, a brown and black dog beside her, and a faint outline of a woman smiling nearby. "That's you," Emily whispered once, pointing at the figure. Madison felt a lump form in her throat, though she only smiled and asked for another picture. Gradually, Emily began to talk, her words halting at first, then flowing like a stream that had been blocked for too long. She told Madison about her father, Jack Carter, a paramedic who had served overseas and once saved a child from a burning vehicle. Her eyes glowed faintly when she spoke his name. "Daddy says Rex understands words," she said one evening, leaning against Madison's shoulder. "He listens when you're sad." Madison nodded, watching the dog's steady gaze as he lay near the foot of the bed, alert even in rest. She learned from the nurses that Jack's service record was impeccable, and that his wife, Emily's mother, had passed away 2 years earlier after a brief illness. Madison found herself wondering what kind of man left behind a home that now carried such silence, and what kind of grief could hollow out a family so deeply. When the doctors made their rounds, their tone was careful. The tests confirmed the diagnosis: bladder and bowel dysfunction likely caused by stress and prolonged neglect. It was treatable, but required consistent care. Madison listened to every instruction as if she were studying for an exam, asking about medication, diet, and therapy routines. She noticed, too, that Veronica never once called or visited. Her absence spoke more loudly than words ever could. The hospital administrator, a gray-haired woman named Dr. Eleanor Reeves, took Madison aside one afternoon and said gently, "We're opening a review on the child's living conditions. You might be asked for a statement." Madison simply nodded. She had already decided what she would say. Outside the hospital window, the world moved on with its ordinary rhythms. Cars passing, people hurrying to work, leaves spinning in the late autumn wind. But inside room 204, time seemed to slow. Madison would sit by the bed while Emily napped, watching her chest rise and fall, sometimes reading aloud from the storybooks she brought from school. Rex remained ever near, his large body curled protectively beside the bed, his head lifting at every sound. He had a way of watching Madison as if weighing her intentions, and when he seemed satisfied, he would sigh softly and rest again. The nurses had begun calling him the quiet guardian. On the 5th day, Madison arrived to find Emily drawing again, the paper covered with colorful shapes. "That's Daddy's truck," she explained shyly, pointing to a red rectangle with flashing lights drawn at the top. "He saves people." Her voice carried a kind of pride that felt fragile, like glass that could break if touched too roughly. Madison smiled. "He must be very brave," Emily nodded solemnly. "He is. But he had to go far away to help other people." There was no resentment in her voice, only a tired understanding that sounded far too adult for a 6-year-old child. Later that evening, when Madison stepped into the hallway, she found Dr. Reeves reviewing Emily's file. "This little one has been through more than most adults," the doctor murmured. "She's lucky to have someone looking out for her now." Madison looked through the window at the girl asleep beside her dog and said quietly, I think she's the brave one. By the end of the week, Emily's condition had improved. The dark circles beneath her eyes began to fade, and she smiled more often, though she still flinched when a nurse entered too suddenly or raised a voice. Rex had become something of a celebrity among the staff, obedient, calm, and fiercely loyal, lying motionless by the bed until Emily stirred. He would then lift his head, glance toward her, and wait for her small hand to rest on his muzzle before closing his eyes again. He won't even eat unless she tells him to, one nurse laughed. Madison found herself thinking that Rex understood more than he let on. As the days passed, the absence of Veronica became impossible to ignore. No phone calls, no visits, no messages. It was Madison who answered every question, who signed every form, who made sure the girl was never alone. When Dr. Reeves mentioned that the hospital was coordinating with social services to review guardianship, Madison didn't hesitate. "Do whatever is necessary," she said quietly. "Just make sure she's safe." Her tone carried the calm conviction of someone who had already made peace with the weight of responsibility. A week after her admission, the doctors gathered Madison in the hallway to share their final recommendation. "Her body is stable now," Dr. Reeves said, "but her recovery will depend on the consistency of care she receives at home." She paused. "If she's returning to that house, someone trustworthy needs to check on her regularly." Madison didn't need convincing. "I'll go," she said immediately. The doctor smiled faintly, as if she had expected no other answer. The official discharge papers were signed that afternoon. That evening, as Madison packed Emily's small belongings into a paper bag, the child's eyes filled with uncertainty. "Will you still come?" she asked quietly. Madison brushed a strand of hair from her face and said, "Every day I can." Rex, sensing the tension, pressed his head against Emily's knee, his dark eyes following Madison's every move. They left the hospital together, the woman, the child, and the dog, stepping into the soft twilight that smelled faintly of rain and pine. The doctors had made one condition: Madison was to visit regularly, ensuring that Emily's treatment was followed and her environment remained stable, while the hospital completed its report on guardianship. As the car pulled away from the parking lot, Madison glanced at the rearview mirror. Emily was leaning against Rex, half asleep, her hand still tangled in the dog's fur. For the first time in weeks, her face was peaceful. Madison gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her heart steady with quiet resolve. She knew that the road ahead would not be simple, but she also knew she could no longer step aside. For nearly a week after returning from the hospital, the little house at the edge of Willow Creek had remained quiet. Emily grew calmer under Madison's regular visits, and Rex shadowed her everywhere, his presence a silent anchor in a place that otherwise felt hollow. But peace in that house was never meant to last. On a rain-soaked night, when the town's streets shimmered under flickering streetlights, the door burst open and Veronica stumbled in from the darkness, her movements heavy and uneven, the sharp scent of liquor clinging to her like smoke. Inside, the only sounds were the low hum of the television and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. On the table, beneath a scatter of unopened mail, lay the hospital bills, a reminder of responsibilities she had long tried to ignore. When her eyes met the numbers printed across the page, her face hardened, and with a violent motion she crushed the paper in her fist. The anger rose swiftly, fierce and unrestrained, and the quiet house shuddered as she began to shout. Her voice tore through the quiet, first a sharp mutter, then a full scream. Bottles clattered from the counter, a lamp fell and shattered. "You think I'm made of money?" she shouted to no one in particular, but the echo carried down the hall to where a small figure stirred in bed. Emily sat up slowly, her eyes wide, clutching the worn edge of her blanket. She had learned long ago that silence was her safest answer, but silence did not save her tonight. Veronica burst into the room, eyes wild, the veins in her neck standing out. "You," she spat, pointing a trembling finger, "you're the reason for all of this. A filthy burden I never asked for." The words cut through the air like shards of glass. Rex, the German shepherd, rose immediately from where he had been lying at the foot of the bed. His body tensed, muscles rippling beneath his sable coat, the black saddle along his back rising like a ridge. A low growl vibrated in his chest, deep and deliberate. He stepped between the child and the woman, head lowered, ears forward. Veronica's face twisted in fury. "Get out of my way!" she shouted, kicking toward him. Her foot struck his shoulder, but the dog held his ground. His growl deepened, not of attack, but of warning. Emily's small hands clutched his fur, whispering his name through tears. "Rex, please." The room smelled of liquor and fear. Veronica's anger burned hotter. She grabbed a nearby vase and hurled it toward the wall. It shattered behind the dog, the sound echoing through the hallway. "Out!" she screamed, her words slurred and shaking. "Both of you, out!" She pushed Emily toward the door, her movements harsh, sending the child stumbling into the narrow corridor. Rex barked once, a sharp sound that filled the air with alarm. Veronica kicked at him again, this time with enough force to send him backward. "Go on, get out!" she shouted, flinging open the front door. The wind rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and wet earth. Emily was crying now, trembling as she stood on the threshold. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Veronica was beyond reason. "You heard me," she screamed. "Get out of my house, you filthy little burden!" The door slammed shut behind her. The rain soaked through the porch in seconds, pooling around the child's bare feet. She sank down onto the wooden steps, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her small frame shaking under the downpour. Above her, the storm roared, wind, thunder, and the relentless rhythm of falling rain. Rex stood frozen for a moment at the edge of the yard, his fur slick with water. He turned once toward the door, then toward the child, his instincts tearing him in two directions. A flash of lightning lit the sky, followed by a crash of thunder that made Emily flinch. Rex barked, once then again, before bolting into the night. His paws splashed against the wet pavement, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he ran. He knew the way. He had followed Madison's scent before, had watched her kindness like a promise. Tonight, he followed that memory through the rain, guided by something more powerful than thought: loyalty. Miles away, Madison stirred in her sleep, the sound of furious barking breaking through the storm outside. She rose from her bed, heart pounding, the clock glowing 1:47 a.m. The barking grew louder, desperate, mixed with scratching against the door. When she opened it, the sight froze her. Rex stood drenched, his fur plastered to his body, eyes wild with fear. He barked again, then tugged at the sleeve of her robe, pulling with surprising force. "Rex," she whispered, "what is it?" But she already knew. There was something in his gaze, urgent, pleading, that told her this was no ordinary night. She grabbed her keys and raincoat, and the dog turned instantly toward the road, leading her into the darkness. The drive through Willow Creek felt endless, the rain pounding so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. Madison's fingers clenched the wheel as she followed the dog's silhouette darting ahead, his reflection flashing in the headlights. When she reached the familiar lane, her breath caught. The house loomed in the storm, lights flickering through the cracked blinds. She jumped from the car, calling out into the wind, "Emily!" There was no answer. Her shoes splashed through the puddles as she ran to the porch, and there, curled beneath the eaves, was the small shape she feared to find. Emily sat huddled against the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably, soaked to the bone. Her lips were blue, her eyes half closed. "Oh my God," Madison whispered, dropping to her knees. She reached out, pulling the child into her arms. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. "She said I can't stay," she murmured weakly, her voice trembling. "She said I'm dirty." Madison's throat tightened. "You're not," she whispered fiercely, pressing the girl's cold forehead against her shoulder. "You're not." Rex circled them both, barking once at the door, then lowering his head to nudge Emily's leg, as if counting every breath she took. Inside the house, Veronica's drunken shouting had faded into the distance. Madison didn't look back. She wrapped Emily in the spare blanket from her car, lifting her as gently as she could. "We're going home," she said softly. The words came out steady, almost like a vow. Rex followed close behind, his head low, his tail tucked, never straying more than a step away. The three of them moved through the rain, a woman, a child, and a loyal dog, illuminated briefly by the headlights before vanishing into the dark road beyond. When they reached Madison's small home near the town's edge, she ushered them both inside, closing the door against the storm. The room filled with warmth from the old radiator, the scent of wet fur and faint rainwater clinging to the air. Madison dried Emily's hair with a towel, then wrapped her in a blanket, sitting beside her on the couch until the trembling eased. Rex lay at the child's feet, his amber eyes fixed on her face, refusing to rest until she slept. Madison brushed a tear from the corner of her own eye. The house was silent except for the wind outside and the slow, steady breathing of the child now safe in her arms. That night, long after the storm had quieted, Madison sat awake beside the window, watching the rain fade into mist. Rex slept near Emily, one paw resting protectively over her blanket. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Madison knew the night was not the end of it, only the quiet before whatever came next. But for now there was only peace, the fragile kind that comes when something broken begins, finally, to heal. A week had passed since the stormy night when Madison found the little girl on her doorstep. The early light of a new morning stretched softly across Willow Creek, touching the quiet streets, the wooden fences, and the porch of a small house where hope had quietly begun to grow again. Down the lane, a dark pickup truck rolled to a stop. The engine idled for a moment, and then a tall man stepped out, his movements slow, as if he were bracing himself for something he both longed for and feared. Jack Carter had returned from duty at last. His face carried the weary calm of a man who had seen too much and lost too much. But beneath that calm was something deeper, a father's longing that had survived every mile between battlefields and home. He stood at Madison's gate for a long while before knocking, listening to the sound of laughter from inside, the high, bright sound of a child reading out loud, a woman's gentle voice correcting her, and the low rumble of a German shepherd breathing at their feet. When Madison opened the door, the look in Jack's eyes stopped her for a moment, exhaustion mixed with gratitude, and the kind of tenderness that needed no words. Behind her, Emily was sitting on the floor beside Rex, her cheeks flushed with health, her small hands tracing letters in a book as she sounded them out softly. Rex lifted his head at the sight of Jack, his tail thumping once against the floor as if recognizing a familiar soul returning. Jack knelt slowly, unsure if his daughter would remember him the way she used to. "Hey, sunshine," he whispered. The little girl looked up, blinked, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Emily ran forward, burying herself in his arms, her small voice breaking into tears and laughter all at once. Rex pressed close beside them, resting his head against Jack's shoulder, as if confirming that everything lost had finally found its way home again. Madison stood quietly by the doorway, watching the reunion with the quiet grace of someone who had already given all the comfort she could. When the moment calmed, Madison led Jack to the kitchen table where a stack of papers waited. Medical records, photographs of bruises carefully documented by the hospital, and a typed statement bearing her signature. She spoke gently, not as a teacher now, but as someone who had witnessed too much neglect to stay silent. "Jack," she said softly, "you need to see this." He sat in silence, eyes scanning each page, his jaw tightening as he turned them one by one. The weight of each photograph hit him like a blow, not from the violence they showed, but from the thought that he hadn't been there to stop it. "I should have known," he murmured, voice cracking. Madison shook her head. "No one could have known, not from where you were." By afternoon, they were sitting in the small office of the county courthouse. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Jack handed over the file, his fingers trembling as he signed his name on the statement of complaint. The clerk, an older man with kind eyes, looked at him with quiet understanding. "You're doing the right thing," he said simply. Outside, the sky had turned gray again, but Jack didn't notice. For the first time in years, his mission was clear, not in a foreign desert or a broken city, but here, protecting his daughter from the harm that had found her at home. Weeks passed before the court convened, each day a test of patience and faith. Madison sat beside Jack through every hearing, her calm presence anchoring him as witness after witness spoke. When the verdict finally came, guilty on all counts of neglect and abuse, Veronica showed no remorse. Her eyes were cold, distant, as the judge pronounced a 5-year sentence. The gavel fell with a hollow sound, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then Emily, sitting quietly beside Madison, reached for her father's hand. Jack gathered her close, unable to stop the tears that came, not from anger, but from the release of all the fear he had carried. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of a child whispering, "It's okay, Daddy. We're safe now." After the trial, the weeks unfolded with a quiet steadiness that felt new and fragile. Jack filed his discharge papers, leaving behind the uniform that had defined him for half his life. He bought a small house near Madison's, one with a wide porch that looked out toward the hills. Every morning, he cooked breakfast for Emily, sometimes burning the toast, sometimes laughing so hard he forgot the coffee. Madison visited often, helping Emily with her lessons, while Rex, ever the watchful guardian, divided his time between their two homes, patrolling the yards as if guarding a border known only to him. There were nights when Jack would sit by the porch with Rex lying at his feet, staring into the quiet sky. He often thought of the strange twists of fate that had brought him here, the battles that had scarred him, the loss that had nearly undone him, and the people who had saved his child when he could not. He had seen men risk their lives for their brothers in arms, but this quiet act of compassion from a schoolteacher and a loyal dog, felt like a different kind of valor altogether. When Madison joined him sometimes, they spoke little. Words seemed too small for what gratitude really meant. One afternoon, as spring came early to Willow Creek, Madison stopped by with a small wooden plaque. She had it made at the local crafts fair. It read, "To Rex, for bravery, loyalty, and love beyond measure." Jack knelt beside the dog, running his hand along the sable coat marked with its black saddle. "You saved her," he whispered. Rex looked up with calm, amber eyes, as if to say he'd only done what was right. Madison smiled. "Sometimes," she said softly, "heroes don't wear uniforms." Jack nodded. "No," he said, looking at Emily laughing in the yard. "Sometimes they just have fur and a heart that never gives up." That first morning of their new life felt almost unreal. The sun poured through the open window, spilling across the wooden floor. Emily chased Rex across the lawn, her laughter ringing through the quiet neighborhood, while Jack stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching her with eyes that glistened but no longer carried the weight of grief. The breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and something like peace. Madison arrived a little later, waving from the gate, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt that home wasn't just a place. It was a promise. As the morning light deepened, Rex trotted back toward the porch, tongue lolling, tail sweeping the air. Emily followed, out of breath but smiling, her cheeks flushed with joy. Jack lifted her into his arms, holding her high against the sunlight. "You're my brave girl," he whispered, his voice breaking just slightly. She grinned, "And Rex is our hero." He laughed softly, nodding. "He always will be." In that moment, everything, the pain, the fear, the loss, felt distant, like a storm that had finally passed. Later that day, as Madison walked home along the quiet path lined with wildflowers, she looked back once more at the house on the hill. Jack standing at the porch, Emily waving from his arms, Rex lying peacefully at their feet. The sunlight wrapped around them like a blessing. And in that stillness, it was clear. Some stories don't end with grand victories or medals. They end with kindness, the quiet kind that heals without asking for anything in return. Sometimes the quietest moments speak the loudest. In a world that often rushes past pain and kindness alike, it is the small acts of love, the gentle hands, the patient hearts, the loyal companions that hold us together. There are people, and even creatures, who give everything they have, not for glory or reward, but simply because compassion lives inside them. Their sacrifices may go unnoticed, their stories untold, but they are the reason the world still has warmth left in it. If this story has touched something within you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you wish, subscribe to stay with us as we continue telling stories of quiet courage and love that endures. May God bless you and those you hold dear, and may kindness always find its way back to you.